team, it's your boy Neal back with another reaction video, guys. Here we are with how Australia is crashing the world economy and taking down China. What y'all doing over there, Aussies? What y'all doing in that land down under? I'm about to find out. Before I do, make sure you subscribe to the channel, ring notification bell, get a video a thumbs up so it gets suggested. Where we go?
This is the Australian ship called the Topaz. In June of 2020, this ship left the port of Queensland in Australia with 90,000 tons of coal as its cargo. And its destination
90,000 tons? Jesus!
Was the port of Jingtang, where it was set to unload its coal and then travel back to Australia over the course of several days. But that's not what happened, because once the Topaz reached the port of Jingtang, it was not allowed into the Chinese port. So the ship waited. 1 month passed, 2 months, 6 months, then 10 months. And eventually, the ship and all of its crew found itself being stranded at sea for nearly an entire year with no end in sight.
So it was, whoa! They went over there with 90,000 tons of China, expecting to drop it off. But China was like, nah, y'all can't come here. Nope, not having. So they waited. A trip that was only supposed to take several days. They legit were stranded out there for about a year, bro. Jesus.
And as it turns out, this event would foreshadow one of the biggest economic issues that we are currently witnessing today. But to explain why this event happened, why this event is also so important, and why it's creating a global economic crisis today, you must know that this crisis that we are currently experiencing may have actually started with a small bird just a few decades ago. A bird that caused one of the biggest crises of the 20th century. This is the Chinese sparrow. In the 1950s, the Chinese government didn't know much about these birds except for, well, one thing. And that thing was, well, they found out that these sparrows ate on average 4 pounds of Chinese grain per year. Now, on its surface, this may not seem like much, especially when you consider that all of the sparrows in China consume only a very small fraction of 1% of the grain in China. But at the time, the Chinese thought that this small fraction of a percentage was too much. You see, China in the 1950s...
You couldn't even let go of a small percentage of grain. They said, nah, that 1%, nah, that's too much. We got to get rid of these sparrows.
Was trying its best to adopt communist economic policies while becoming completely self-sufficient in regards to agriculture. So, in order to accomplish their goal, they banned privatization of all agricultural products within the country. They also decided that all of the food shall be collected and distributed by the government. They also changed their farming techniques to match that of the Soviet Union. They decreased crop diversity to help boost production quotas. And lastly, they stopped trading resources with all Western nations in hopes of becoming completely self-sufficient. And all of those policy effects took place virtually overnight, which caused a massive shock to China's agricultural system. And soon, China would begin to experience a decrease in their food production, as well as a very serious national famine. However,
I can imagine, like, you can't just change all of that overnight, bro. Like, that's something that you gotta gradually put into play. But to do all that just that's insane.
There's one thing that would push this crisis over the edge, and that, of course, was the sparrow. You see, remember how the Chinese government didn't like that sparrows ate a small amount of their grain? Well, as it turns out, the Chinese government decided to order the extermination of all sparrows from the country in hopes of boosting food production. And so, over the course of just a couple years, millions of sparrows in China were killed, and as a result, the sparrow became nearly extinct. And it would not take too long before China realized it had made one of the largest mistakes in the country's history. This one single policy change ended up making their famine substantially worse. You see, what China did not know was that sparrows were the main predators for all of the pests in their crop fields, meaning that as soon as the sparrows went away, the crop-eating pests, mainly locusts, began swarming the entire country. And these locusts were not eating just a small fraction of 1% of the food like the sparrows were. These swarms of locusts literally destroyed entire farms or even villages of crops at a time. So it was this event that ended up making the famine in China turn into the Great Chinese Famine.
They effed up because and the farmers and stuff probably knew it. You know what I'm saying? People who knew agriculture there probably knew it, but the people at the top probably didn't know agriculture. Probably didn't know about any of this, so they didn't know, and they effed up trying to eliminate the sparrows. Only eating a small 1%, just 1% of the grain, but was taking out all of the locusts, taking out all of the pests that eat this stuff, taking them out. Now you done effed up, then almost dang near exterminated this sparrow. Like, how did you even do that? Like, were they shooting them down? Were they putting something in their crops that was devastating the sparrows? How did they even do that? On one hand is what I'm wondering. But now, those pests that eat these crops are going unchecked. Now these locusts is running through these crops, bro. This is insane.
A crisis that caused tens of millions of people to starve to death over a 5-year span.
Tens of million people over 5 years? That's effing sad.
And remember, all it took was a few policy changes and one hasty economic decision to cause a crisis on a massive scale. And well, that brings us to today. Remember that ship, the Topaz, that we last saw being stranded at sea in China? Well, as it turns out, this was also because of a hasty economic decision that came from the Chinese government. You see, in June of 2020, just a few months into the pandemic, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison called for an investigation into the origin of the pandemic in China. Now, on its surface, this may not have seemed like much of a story at the time, but in reality, this would be the instigator for the global crisis that we are seeing today. This is because China did not take this criticism of the Australian Prime Minister very well. In fact, because of a handful of seemingly minor sentences from the Australian Prime Minister, China decided to start a trade war with Australia. And again, on its surface, there should have been a clear winner of this trade war, as China's economy is roughly 10 times larger than that of Australia's. But what China did not realize was how reliant it was on Australia. You see, China ended up banning or placing high tariffs on things like barley, beef, and about a dozen other Australian products. And as it turns out, one of these banned items was coal. And so, well, that is why in June of 2020, as the Topaz and 60 other bulk carriers were on their way to China, they all of a sudden were not allowed into Chinese ports with their coal. Because, well, China overnight banned and canceled all of their trade deals in relation to coal. Now, to most Western nations, coal...
See, you letting your personal feelings. This is what happened. You can't make emotional decisions. You gotta think. I don't know. I feel like you're in the top government. You're supposed to have people around you. Everybody that knows all the consequences and effects that could happen if you make this decision. And you talk to them about that decision, and you learn of all the consequences that could happen, and you learn if it's really worth it that the Australian government said, because they said some stuff that might have offended you. Okay, is it worth it to stop all trades overnight with them? How is that going to affect our economy? You probably thinking our economy 10 times bigger than Australia's. This is going to affect Australia much more than it's going to affect us. But you're supposed to have people in the room to say, hey, before you make this decision, XYZ is going to happen if you make this decision. It's not going to be good for us. I guess they don't got that person, or that person's scared to speak up, or I'm not sure, but keep it going.
Isn't that important to their respective economies and infrastructure. For example, countries like Canada, France, the UK, and the Nordic countries produce less than 10% of their electricity from coal. And even on the upper end of the Western nations like the United States and Germany, they only produce about 15 to 20% of their electricity from coal. But then we have China. And well, China produces over 65% of its electricity from coal, meaning that the
Over 65%, and you stop trade, and that much coal is coming, and you said we don't want it? Come on.
less coal China has available to them, the less likely it'll be able to produce electricity for its country. Now, China is actually the world's largest producer of coal, and roughly 75 to 90% of all coal used in China is produced domestically. However, for coal that is used for industrial processes, like the making of metals, and for a large fraction of its coal power plants, China is reliant upon coal imports from other countries in order to fulfill its needs. And well, who do you think was at the top of that list for coal imports to China in 2020? It was, of course, Australia. Before the coal ban, China was importing roughly 78 million metric tons of coal from Australia per year, and to put that in perspective, the next closest nation was Indonesia, where they were importing roughly 48 million tons of coal. And so, slowly, from June of 2020 up until today, China's coal reserves kept depleting, in part due to stopping the imports from Australia. Now, it's also worth noting that during this time, there was some major flooding in southern and eastern Asia that caused many Chinese and Indonesian coal mines to close down. There were also a handful of other policies, such as increasing the safety guidelines for coal companies in China, that also decreased coal production. And so, because of one hasty policy decision against Australia and a few other environmental and policy events, we started to see just a few months ago that Chinese cities began going dark.
Okay, so that person probably said that person in the room that's supposed to say, hey, this is going to happen, probably said, you know, we can survive without Australian coal. We can make it. We can make it work somehow. But I guess, you can't predict the flood. You can't predict some of these natural things to happen, like these natural disasters. You can't predict those. And then, it's good that you made the mines more safe and there's more safety policies. That's always a good thing. But that sounds like that a couple of things outside of their power really effed them over. And but you get rid of the person that's providing you the most coal to keep your power plants producing metal and stuff like that.
Power outages began affecting factories and homes, supply chains began getting severely disrupted again, and Chinese banks that had loans with these coal companies began seeing the signs of defaults on these loans. And as this began happening, China began implementing new policies such as ramping up coal production in their working mines and also importing more coal from other nations that weren't Australia. They also began mandating cutting electricity consumption from factories and residences, and also made their banks start making extremely risky loans to new upstart coal companies in China. But at the end of the day, none of those short-term solutions worked, and China was forced to do something that it did not want to do. Remember those 60 or so Australian bulk carriers that were stranded in China? Well, as it turns out, China became so desperate for coal that just a few weeks ago, they allowed some of those stranded ships to unload their coal into Chinese ports. Now, it's also worth mentioning that some Australian ships are still stranded after being at sea for well over a year. And many of these ships also got rerouted to different countries like India and South Korea, who ended up actually buying a lot of this stranded Australian coal. But the effects of this Chinese energy crisis, and what it should be called, which is the Chinese coal shortage, are being felt worldwide right now. Many large companies that are reliant on Chinese manufacturing are seeing similar or even longer delays than what they were seeing at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. In fact, there have been a handful of large corporations that have begun switching their manufacturing out of China and into other countries or even domestically, largely because companies are realizing that manufacturing in China is becoming more unreliable. And because of decisions like this and the shutdown of some factories and the electricity shortages, China's manufacturing industry shrank for the second time in modern history this year. And so, where is this all going? Well, this coal crisis is already taking a chunk out of China's economy and will likely do so for the foreseeable future. And despite this ongoing energy crisis, China still refuses to lift the ban on Australian coal simply because of a few sentences said over a year ago. And a few recent quotes from a Chinese energy specialist and a Chinese coal data company stated that the biggest provinces now only have 9 to 14 days worth of coal reserves left. And with winter coming soon in China, the country will have to make a tough decision. Will it potentially allow power outages in winter and a continual shutdown of its core economy simply because of those few sentences said by the Australian Prime Minister? Or will it lift the bans on Australian coal, admitting that the government made a hasty decision that ended up creating an energy crisis that the country didn't expect? What do you think will happen? And all this means is that China has a few weaknesses. And those weaknesses are its energy consumption and its irrational and hasty economic policies. And as it turns out, Australia, the seemingly innocuous Western nation, ended up accidentally revealing the weaknesses of China to the world. It also revealed that Australia is one of the very few nations that can influence China's economy directly to the point of a national crisis. And who knows? Maybe as Australia and other Western nations continue to get closer, we may begin to see a further divide between China and the Western world. Now I just want to make one more quick note, and that is a video game that I am developing now officially has a Steam page. So if you do want to support this channel, just go and check that out and maybe leave a wish list on Steam. That really helps out a lot. But for now, remember to check out my documentaries playlist if you want to see more videos like this. And please leave a like and subscribe, because still over 90% of you that watch my videos are not subscribed to this channel. That is quite insane. So please do that, and maybe we hit 1 million subscribers at some point in the next year or so, who knows. I appreciate you all. Make sure to click on my next video, and I'll see you guys there in just a few seconds.
Yeah, that's correct. I'm intrigued. Does anybody know? I know the video was made a year ago, so can somebody let me know in the comment section? Is China still, do they still have the ban, Australian ban on coal, or have they lifted it? Has the economy bounced back and the manufacturing bounced back? Are they still struggling? Anybody got that information? Let me know in the comment section. I'm very intrigued to know. But that's all we got for this one. You guys got a favorite video suggestion? You can subscribe to Patreon and drop it in the comment section. It's your boy Neal. Out.